We're going to finish the 8th chapter of Bava Metzia, and we're into questions about rental. The last few Mishnayot they're poetic. They are alliterative, and they all begin with the words hamaskir, someone who rents. So in the previous Mishnah, we were discussing someone who rents a house in the rainy season, hamaskir bait, lachavero. And now we're going to just carry on with this poetic theme and with the same subject as well. Hamaskir bait lachavero, someone who rents a house to his fellow. But now we're not going to talk about time. We're going to talk about content, about furnishings. So we are flicking backwards from, well, we'll get back into time very soon, but for the moment, we're in furnishing. Hamaskir bait lachavero, someone rents a house to his friend. Hamaskir chayav badelet uvaneger uvamanul. The renter, the landlord, is obligated to provide the door and the bolt and the lock. Uvachol davar shehu maaseh aman, and with anything which is the work of a craftsman. In other words, if it's a specialized piece of equipment, it is assumed that the landlord has to provide it. Now, Kahati quotes the Rambam. I can't find this in the Rambam, but Kahati quotes the Rambam as saying, look, everything goes according to the custom of the land. And we've seen this before in Bava Metzia. But the Mishnah is clear about the fact that anything to do with a craftsman is provided by the landlord. And then the Mishnah goes on, aval davar she'eino ma'aseh aman, something which is not the provision of the craftsman, hasocher osehu, the tenant provides. So if you need to put a ladder up to get to an upstairs floor, the tenant provides that. But the lock, the bolt, the door, stuff which is fitted to the house is provided by the landlord. What about the manure? Hazevel. Hazevel shel bal habayit. The manure belongs to the owner of the house. Now, why are we talking about manure, you might ask? Well, in the time of the Mishnah, we've talked about this. The houses would be arranged around a courtyard. And the presumption seems to be that the tenant has rented the house, but he's not rented the courtyard. And of course, animals coming in to visit are going to drop their dung in the courtyard. And dung is valuable. You can make fire out of dung in Siberia, in the Gulag. They would make fire out of dung. And we've read in the Mishnah that you can collect dung and make fire out. So the dung is a valuable piece of property, but it belongs to the courtyard. So the owner of the house, and that's why the Mishnah rules, Hazevel shel bal habayit, the dung belongs to the owner of the house, obviously excluding dung which the tenant's animal produces itself. But ein lasocher doesn't belong to the tenant. The tenant only owns the rubbish that comes out of the oven and the stove. So, in other words, domestic waste belongs to the tenant, but kind of communal waste that comes in with traffic belongs to the landlord. If we're going to have a discussion about who owns the, so to speak, the waste, what about who owns rent if there's a question of time? So again, hamaskir, someone who rents. All of these Mishnayot begin hamaskir. Hamaskir bait lachavero lashana. Someone rents out a house by the year. Venita bra hashana, and the year is made a leap year. So he thought he rented it out for 12 months, but it turns out, Adar comes along. Maybe he rented it out at the beginning of the rainy season in Tishri. Adar comes along, and the year is going to be intercalated. So there's a 13-month year. So who gets the benefit of the extra month? Well, according to the Mishnah, According to the Mishnah, nit abra la socher. The extra month, the intercalation goes to the tenant. Hiskir lo la chodeshim. If he rented it by the month and the year was made a leap year, the extra month goes to the landlord. The presumption is that essentially a monthly rent is paid monthly. So in a 13-month year, you pay 13 months, but an annual rent is quoted annually. So in a 13-month year, you still only pay 1 year's rent. But let's carry on, because we'll see, and we'll look at the Rambam in a minute. Things are not so simple. Maaseh b'Tzipori. It happened once in Tzipori. Tzipori is a village in the Galil where actually a rich collection of rabbis used to hang out. In fact, you can still go and see the archaeological remains at Tzipori. There's a beautiful bathhouse. You get a sense walking around Tzipori of a village of the time of the Mishnah. Maaseh b'Tzipori. It happened in Tzipori. V'echad shesachar merchatz. Someone rented a bathhouse. Well, as we said, there is a beautiful bathhouse in Tzipori. We can see people used to have this kind of thing. Shesachar merchatz mechavero. He rented a bathhouse from his fellow. Bishnei masar dinar zahav lashana. And at 12 golden dinars a year. Mi dinar zahav lachodesh. A dinar a month. In other words, we quoted the rent two ways. We quoted it at 12 golden dinars a year, and we quoted it at 1 dinar a month. So what are we going to do if the year becomes 13 months? Have we quoted by the year or by the month? Lifnei Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel velifnei Rabbi Yossi. And that whole issue came before Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel and Rabbi Yossi. Ve'amru yachaloku et chodesh ha'ibur. And they ruled, let them share the month of the intercalation. In other words, the extra month. Let them share the cost of the 13th month. In other words, let the rental of the bathhouse be increased from 12 to 12 and a half months per year. And we've already seen, by the way, throughout this 8th chapter, that wherever we can't find a resolution to a conflict, the Mishnah always rules yachaloku. It always rules they should divide. So we're consistent with the chapter. But Maimonides, based on the Gemara, is going to disagree. Ein halacha k'Rabbi Shimon Gamliel velo k'Rabbi Yossi. The halacha is not in accordance with Rabban Shimon Gamliel and Rabbi Yossi. But whenever the rent is quoted monthly, ve'afilu amar kach v'kach l'shana, even if it's quoted annually, kulo la maskir, everything goes to the landlord. Really interesting that Maimonides, following the Gemara, is coming out on the side of the landlord. And he's going to quote a principle. Lefisha ikar etzleinu hakol holech achar pachot shebilashonot. Everything is interpreted. We have a principle that language is always interpreted minimally. So in other words, we get as little as we can from the language. If it's ambiguous, we interpret that minimally. And then he says, look, we have an assumption, a presumption that land is always assumed to belong to the owner. So, lefichach amru, therefore they ruled, and he's not talking about our rabbis now, but the rabbis of the Gemara, they ruled that all the benefit goes to the landlord either way. So the Gemara here seems to be overturning the sages of the Mishnah. But the benefit doesn't always go to the landlord. He does have minimal responsibilities. And this is where the chapter closes. Someone rented a house to his fellow and it fell down. It became uninhabitable. Very common occurrence, actually, certainly in the UK. He has to put up a new house for it. If you're a landlord and you rent out, you have a responsibility to provide. Hayakatan lo yasenu gadol. If it was a small house, he can't provide him with a big one. Maybe the tenant prefers a small house. Gadol lo yasenu katan. If it's a big one, he can't make it small. Echad lo yasenu shnai. If it was one building, he can't make it two. Shanaim lo yasenu echad. If it was two buildings, he can't restore it as one. In other words, as a landlord, he has to fulfill his obligations. Lo yifchot min hachalonot v'lo yosif alehem. He can't reduce the number of windows, and he can't increase them. Ela midat shneihem, without both their consent. The landlord's got certain basic obligations, and without the consent of the tenant, can't change those. That's the principle of equity on which the 8th chapter finishes. As we go into the 9th chapter, we'll see more issues about leasing, but leasing of agricultural land, and that will lead us gently into questions of employment.